Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you tonight from Nashville, Tennessee, of all places. And if you thought it was difficult to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do this from Israel, believe it or not, it's even a little bit harder to do it at 8 p.m. Eastern the day after you flew in from Israel, because I think it's 3 in the morning, but I know it's not. So I'm living in two worlds, but I am happy to be here and to see all of you. And today is February 14th, 2024. And I just want to acknowledge that it is Valentine's Day. And I'm not normally into acknowledging that type of thing, but I bring it up because I want you to know that in Israel, Valentine's Day is now a thing. It wasn't always like this. Back when I was in the army 25 years ago, February 14th was just an ordinary day on the calendar. I don't think anyone knew what Valentine's Day was. I moved back to Israel with my family about 7.5 years ago, and over those 7.5 years, it sort of went from something a few people might have mentioned to something that got a little more attention. You'd see people bringing flowers home on the train on the 14th. Today, it is a holiday on the Israeli calendar, not necessarily for everyone, but it's advertised in shopping malls. There are commercials on television for Valentine's Day. It's not Yom Valentine, it's Valentine's Day, Daled Yud Yud for the day. And this is sort of emblematic of what's happening in Israel overall, that so many American expressions linguistically and American holidays are actually becoming a part of the Israeli calendar. Another example is Black Friday. That Friday in November after Thanksgiving, it's now in Israel too. And I think most Israelis have no idea why it's called Black Friday or that it's related necessarily to Thanksgiving, but it's a big sale day in America. And even Christmas decorations go up in many shopping malls, not because more and more people are actually celebrating Christmas, but I think they enjoy the kitsch, they enjoy the decorations. So many Israelis are traveling overseas now, have been to America. And certainly within the young, hip, high-tech community, Valentine's Day is becoming more normalized, and you can get in trouble if you're a guy in Israel on Valentine's Day and you do not bring home card, balloon, flowers to your loved one. I should mention also that Israel has its own Valentine's Day, Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av. So now those of us in Israel have 2 days of the year when we can get scolded for not behaving correctly. That's twice as much trouble we can get in compared to Americans. But I just wanted to point that out, that it's now a holiday in Israel, and I made sure to have flowers delivered to my own wife so I wouldn't get in trouble. It's now a regular thing. And in a very strange way, it also relates to the topic we're talking about tonight. The title of tonight's broadcast is Who Knows Two? And I'm going to share three narratives about the two Israels. I've talked a lot on this podcast about how since October 7th, Israel has really come together and unified, that the civilians, the citizens are they are the ones who are moving the country forward. But I also think it's important to point out that in many ways, there still really are two different Israels. And Valentine's Day is emblematic of that as well. There's that whole population of the young, hip, high techs who celebrate Valentine's Day, but for so much of Israel, they don't. The ones in the periphery, outside of the center of the country. What we often say in Israel, the center is Hadera to Gadera. Hadera is, I'm not sure if you'd even call it a suburb. It's sort of the northernmost city that can be called the center of Israel, just north of Netanya. And Gadara is sort of a southern-ish, the very northern tip of the southern border of Israel. If you're between Hadera and Gadara, you're considered living in the center of the country. But if you're north of Hadera or south of Gadara, you're in what's called the peripheria, the periphery. And for them, Black Friday, Valentine's Day are much less of a thing, if they are anything at all. So Valentine's Day sort of does tie in with this idea of who knows two, and the stories I'll be telling you tonight of the two separate Israels. So the first example that I want to make clear of a separate Israel than the one we might be thinking about is that we still have close to 200,000 Israelis who are not living in their homes. They have been displaced in the north and in the south. And As you know, in the last 3 weeks when I was back in Israel, I was talking a lot about how normal life seemed, that restaurants were full. Whether this is good or bad is open for discussion, but people are out. People are living in Tel Aviv. They're going to movies. You can't just go into a restaurant. You've got to put your name down and wait half an hour to get a table. Life in so many ways is back to normal, but I realized today that that's very much, the narrative I'm living. That's Joel's story. Joel, who lives in Ra'anana in a pretty well-off community in the center of the country. We can't remember that there is this other Israel, these 200,000 whose lives have been completely upended by the war in Gaza and by the impending war in the north. The north is cleared out not only because we're having more and more rocket attacks from Hezbollah, but also because the army is turning the north of Israel into a war zone or one big military base. It's closed to traffic. You need a special permit to get in, a military permit. And if you do go up there, you'll see tanks and Humvees and other military equipment. There's really no other way to say it, preparing for what's ahead. So when we talk about Israel being back to normal and the hustle and bustle of Tel Aviv life, we can't forget that there is this whole other Israel that's been displaced. These people are, for the most part, living in hotels that have been converted into living spaces entirely for them. These hotels do not check in normal guests. If you want to visit one of these hotels or go into the lobby to try to meet people who've been displaced, you're actually not allowed unless you have special permission as a journalist or from the government. You can't just walk off the street into one of these hotels. They've been turned into apartments, but obviously with much less privacy. It's hotel living, families living together in rooms. Sadly, there have been a few cases of abuse, sexual abuse of children in these hotels by other displaced residents. I wouldn't say that this is common by any means, but we have to point out that that does happen. And, you know, 200,000 Israelis not living in their homes and not expected to return to their homes, certainly for the next, I'd say, half year. That's a very significant number, and they're living a very different reality than the rest of us in the center of Israel are. Just yesterday, a mother and her 15-year-old son were injured seriously in the north of Israel when a missile struck their house. I want to point out these Hezbollah missiles are laser guided with GPS. So unlike Hamas, which fires a missile and sort of hopes it lands somewhere where it might do some damage. And by the way, I think a third of Hamas's rockets actually end up falling back into Gaza. So unlike that, Hamas has missiles that they can punch in the precise location and hit houses, hit cars. They have long-range missiles that could supposedly hit the Kiryat, the main military base in Tel Aviv, power plants, natural gas storage sites. So this war with Hezbollah that's impending is a very serious one, and the people in the north are extremely threatened in a way that even people in the south were not prior to October 7th. In Tzfat, a soldier was killed and 8 were injured, and that number might have gone up when Tzfat was attacked. And I know many Americans, North Americans, Jews around the world, when they go to Israel, Tzfat is one of their favorite places. It's idyllic, it's religious, it really encapsulates the mix between modern Israel and holy ancient Israel. And Tzfat was targeted yesterday, along with some military bases in the north, by Hezbollah. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, our minister of the police force, declared that this is war. And as you know, if you've been listening to this podcast, I'm not a big Itamar Ben-Gvir fan, but it's kind of hard to argue with what he's saying, that Israel, we're in a position now where 200,000 of our people do not feel safe living in their own homes. If that's not war, what is? And that is why so many in Israel expect that a war in the north is going to happen soon, because we know what happens when our enemy is so close to the border. There is a UN resolution that says that Hamas needs to be 30 kilometers away from the border with Israel. They need to be past the Litani River. The UN attempts to enforce so many policies against Israel, but they've never bothered to try to enforce this one, keeping Hezbollah away from the Israeli border, which was agreed to in 2006 after what's known as the Second Lebanon War. But when we talk about two Israels, this is one of the separate Israels I'm talking about, the ones whose lives are not back to normal and who are far from being back to normal at this point. The second story of Who Knows Two, this separate Israel, are the hostages and their families. Many Israelis are debating, myself included, what to do about this hostage dilemma. Not that necessarily we have any say, but it's on our minds. Do we fight this war as if there are no hostages, or do we pursue the hostages as if there is no war? Is there a mix? Can we actually do both? It's becoming more and more clear that it's probably not going to be viable to pursue both goals. But we cannot forget that for the hostages and their families, for the most of them, there really is no dilemma. For most of them, they want the hostages, their loved ones, to come home. We are now, I believe, at day 131 of our war with Hamas. We had a young woman go on Israeli television this week who was a hostage and talk about her ordeal. And she spoke about how she was sexually assaulted at gunpoint by her Hamas captors. And I won't go into the details here. You can see the interview online and read the articles about it. But I think we need to accept the fact that our hostages, certainly the female hostages, there's no other way to put it. They've been sex slaves to Hamas for 131 days, which is a nightmare, an absolute nightmare. So for the hostages and their families, this is the other Israel. The families of the hostages, they are not sleeping, they're barely eating. They all describe themselves as just barely hanging on to survival. So while the rest of us might be going out for dinner in Tel Aviv or to a movie or to a soccer game, which, all of which are happening, for the hostages and their families, it's a completely separate Israel that they are living in. And I have to point out a couple other things. First of all, we had this deal in January where medication would go to the hostages who need them. We have diabetics. We have others who are on medication that they absolutely need in order to stay alive. And finally, France purchased this medication and brokered a deal for it to go. Not only do we not have proof that the medication arrived, but we had 2 hostages released this week, and I'll get to that in a moment. But these hostages needed medication and never received it. So we have every reason to believe that this medication never made it to the hostages as it was intended. And on top of all this, the Prime Minister Netanyahu is now refusing to send an Israeli delegation to Cairo for the next round of talks. And you have to ask what message this sends to the families of the hostages. What Netanyahu is saying is that Hamas's demands are absolutely delusional. Their demands for a complete, not just a ceasefire, but an end to the war and all Israeli forces withdrawing from Gaza. And I agree, and most Israelis agree, that we cannot do that. We cannot end the war at this point. The more and more I talk to soldiers who are there, the more I am convinced that we really are squashing Hamas and that they are suffering in ways that the media, even in Israel, is not necessarily covering for various reasons. So I do believe that our campaign against Hamas is effective. However, many Israelis, and myself included, most believe that we do need to send a delegation to Cairo. Even if Hamas's demands are delusional, we can try to restructure something. If we have the upper hand here because our war is putting pressure on Hamas, it means we might be able to make some demands to release some, if not all, of the hostages. And Netanyahu is flat out refusing to do that. And by the way, Gantz and Eisenkot, who are these 2 former chiefs of staff who are in the war cabinet as emergency members of the government, they're furious that Netanyahu didn't even consult them before deciding not to send a delegation to Cairo. This should have been a decision made by, if not the entire government, then at least this war cabinet. But Netanyahu made this decision himself. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that he's not benefiting. Netanyahu would not benefit from an end to the war and the release of the hostages, because his power would come to an end at that point. The only reason Netanyahu is able to stay in power right now is because the war is going on and we are not ready to hold elections in the midst of the war, and not enough members of the government are ready to abandon the Likud-led government. But if the war were to end, if the hostages were all to come home, which would be good news for so many Israelis, Netanyahu would be out, and I think he has motives to keep this war going as long as possible, and also to have a war in the north take place and expand. I'm not saying we don't need that war. I actually think we do. But I just want to point out that Netanyahu has a motive here, and the fact that he refused to continue any negotiations with Hamas is, I think, a sign to the hostage families that they no longer know where to turn. If their own government, whose duty is to protect the citizens of Israel, is now saying they won't even send a delegation, they feel completely abandoned right now. And that is the second example of the other Israel that we might not be thinking about, or might not be conscious of living a wholly different reality than the one we are in. But alas, they are. The third example of who knows two, a separate Israel, has to do with the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, as we call them in Israel, the black hat ultra-Orthodox, and the army. And before I go into it, I just want to explain a little bit about how the army works so you have some background. You know, in Israel, we refer to the army as Tzva Ha'am, which means an army of the people. But we really do need to call that Tzva Ha'am an army of the people with an asterisk, because not all Israeli citizens serve in the army. Not even all Jewish Israelis serve in the Israeli army. Let me typically explain how it typically works in Israel. In Israel, 18-year-old Jews are drafted into the army for 2 years and 8 months if they're male, and 2 years if they're women. So men and women serve, boys for 2 years, 8 months, and girls for 2 years. And it used to be longer. It used to be 3 years for boys and I think a little over 2 years for girls, but it's been shortened with the idea that we don't need as many soldiers as we used to. We're becoming much more dependent on technology. The Air Force can achieve many of our goals that in the past foot soldiers would have to do. We also have incredible special forces and intelligence. So we just don't need the bodies that we used to. And so the service has been shortened over the years. And I remember going through this myself as my kids were my two oldest were entering the army a few years ago when they were making all these changes. They were, thrilled that their service was actually shorter than some of the people they knew who were older than them. And it was down to, so as I said, the current rate is 2 years, 8 months for boys and 2 for girls. And for reserves, the law was that you could serve a maximum of 20 consecutive days in a year, typically up to the age of 45, but it could be older depending on what your job is. Now, in addition to that, we have a new phenomenon in Israel in Hebrew, it's called mechinot, which means preparation. But what really the best way to think about it is a gap year. It's more and more common for young Israelis to take a gap year between high school and the army. These are not gap years where you're backpacking around, through Europe on a bus. It's more that you combine some sort of study with volunteer work and field trips. It's really for a high level of student. The best of the best Israelis are the ones who pursue these. When they come out, they're so much more prepared to go into the army. They become commanders and officers. These gap year programs instill a love for the country and often a lot of volunteer work, which really binds them to other Israelis. They're a positive thing. Not all Israelis go. You have to apply. And some of them are religious, like modern Orthodox, but not all of them are by any means. I remember my kids were looking into it before they went. They ultimately decided not to, but they were interested. So that's just some of the background you have on the army right now. Well, this week, the army changed its policies because of the war going on in Gaza right now and the upcoming war in the north. And when I say the army changed its policies, what I really mean is the government. The Knesset voted this. And here are the new changes. So on the one hand, Service for boys has now been extended back to a full 3 years from 2 years, 8 months. So all boys entering the Army will now have these 4 extra months of service. Reserve duty has been extended to 40 days in a year instead of 20, so doubled. And many of the students who are in these gap year programs right now received a notice that their gap year studies are going to end abruptly. Instead of going all the way through the end of June, they're going to end as early as late March or early April so that they can draft into the Army early. So they're just having their gap years cut off. Why? Because we need more bodies. All of our technology, our Air Force, our intelligence, it's not enough. We need the bodies on the ground in Gaza. And where we really need them are up on the northern border. We're realizing that we're short-staffed on that northern border to keep the northern communities safe. We need to have more soldiers on the ground. And the way we're doing this is by extending the service of those in the Army and those who will draft, and cutting off the gap year of those who were planning to enter the Army in August or next November after their gap year ends in June, and having them draft in March, April, and May instead. Now, in the midst of all this, in this same legislation, the Knesset voted to maintain the exemptions of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi population. So while everyone else is having their length of service extended to 3 years or to 40 days in the reserves, and while gap year students are having their gap years taken away from them, the ultra-Orthodox population, who has been exempt from serving since the state began in 1948, have been granted an ad infinitum exemption where basically they're saying they still do not have to serve. And this is why I'm talking about a tale of two Israels. Who knows two? This is a second Israel within Israel who is not participating within the framework of the military. The military is such a cornerstone of Israeli life. It is really the way that Israelis are bound one to another. And the ultra-Orthodox population never has really participated, except for a few exceptions of volunteers here and there. And now they've been granted another exemption. And Israelis, I'm telling you, are furious about it. The hypocrisy, the fact that so many are seeing their own children's service extended while this other population goes off scot-free so they can study in yeshiva, it's making Israelis irate. And a lot of people are questioning how this could even happen in post-October 7th Israel. How can any politician look us in the eye and say that this is the best way to run the country, to give this whole 15% of the Jewish population, the ultra-Orthodox, to give them an exemption from not serving at all? And the reason, of course, is because the government would fall apart if this exemption were not given. You know, Israel is a coalition-based government. As I've explained before, you need 61, a majority in the Knesset of 120, in order to pass legislation. The Knesset chooses the prime minister. And right now, I think there's 64 in the current coalition, including a few very right-wing extremists and extreme parties who want these exemptions for the ultra-Orthodox to continue. And if they don't get this exemption, they would leave the government would crumble, and Netanyahu would no longer be in power. So these exemptions have been granted, but this is, you want to know what Israelis are talking about, this is one of the topics that Israelis are talking about, the absolute unfairness of this, that there's this whole segment of the population that has never been required to serve and that is now being given an exemption to not have to serve, continue, still no longer has to serve, while the rest of the Israeli population who are serving are having their services extended, their gap years cut, and their reserve military duty doubled. And I just want to say that we have been releasing, I'll add this as well, we have been releasing a lot of reserve soldiers from Gaza. Right now, it's mostly the 18 to 20-year-old conscripts who are serving in Gaza. A lot of the reservists have left so they can go back to university. 1/3 of Israel's university population was serving in Gaza. But these reservists who are being let out, they're all being told, be ready because we plan to call you up within the next 2 to 4 months. to send you up north. So they've been let out, but again, with a little asterisk saying you're going to be coming back soon. So all the more so does it seem to Israelis that there is this second Israel out there who plays by a different set of rules. And a lot of people thought that after October 7th, the politicians would not be able to tell Israelis that this second sort of type of rules would apply. But alas, we are seeing that it still is. So those are my three examples of the two Israels. And who knows too? We have to figure out how to handle each of these separate Israel populations in order for the country to be unified. I now want to go on to some of the other big news from this week, and there was a lot of big news that we will get to. So number one, I'm sure a lot of you saw this, but we did have a rescue of two hostages, Louis Har and Fernando Marman, residents of the South, both of them elderly. And yeah, off the record, a lot of Israelis were saying, we're so happy they're rescued. It's a shame that sort of they're the elderly ones. We need to get some of the younger ones. No one wants to say that out loud, but I'll share that with you. Some people are definitely saying that. But overall, it was a sense of joy that we were able to get two hostages out. It was a very daring raid. It was the best of what the IDF is. It reminded a lot of people of Entebbe. Entebbe was the raid in 1976 on July 4th, America's bicentennial, when Yoni Netanyahu, the older brother of our prime minister, led the daring raid into Uganda to free passengers on the jet that was hijacked. And Yoni Netanyahu was the only casualty in that raid on the Israeli side. He died in that raid. But this raid was reminiscent of that. We had Navy SEALs going into Rafiah at night, storming an apartment, working alongside Yamam, which is the Yechidat Muvcheret Mishtara, the elite forces of the police force, have their own sort of reconnaissance unit. They were working together. And like I said, it was really true to what the IDF is in its best moments. These soldiers were shielding the hostages with their own bodies. As they came under fire from Hamas, they were blocking the hostages with their own bodies to take the fire instead of allowing the hostages to get hit. You can see film footage, video of them getting the hostages onto the helicopter, and one of the Navy SEALs taking off his own boots to put them on the feet of the of one of the hostages who had left barefoot. It really, it really, like I said, exemplifies what the best of the IDF. But I think we shouldn't get our hopes up that this is going to happen more and more. I don't see many more of these raids happening. We had a lot of intelligence that was able to contribute to our being able to rescue these hostages, and I think that is an overlooked part of this war. You cannot just measure the success of this war in Gaza by the number of Hamas operatives killed and the number of rocket launchers taken out. You have to look at the number of Hamas militants who've been captured. And we have captured in the hundreds, if not thousands, of Hamas militants. And we are getting confessions from them. We are hearing details of where hostages are being held. This is another reason why I really do believe we need to continue this war. And as I said, I'm hearing from many soldiers who are coming by my apartment in Israel to pick up supplies, literally from Gaza and going back to Gaza. And they are saying that the media is not covering in full just how successful Israel is. Now, is it because of secrecy and we don't want information out? Is it media bias? I won't get into that. But the soldiers in Gaza firmly believe that we are crushing Hezbollah and also crushing Hamas and sending a message to Hezbollah in doing so. And part of it is getting intelligence that allowed us to rescue these two hostages. But as I said, we still have what, 136 hostages remaining, and I do not see another 136 raids happening. So I believe military pressure is the best way, right? Or is certainly one of the tools we need to be using. But it was a nice uplift for Israel to have these two hostages rescued. Now, on the same day, two soldiers fell in battle, both of them sons of very prominent doctors in northern Israel. And that's sort of the balance we're all going through right now, is the joy of the two hostages being rescued, but the very same day, two of our best from a very elite unit called Magalan killed. in battle. Another piece of news out of Israel, I don't know if this is covered here in the US, is that Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attacks, was spotted this week. We have film footage of him. It's actually from, I think, a week or 2 weeks ago. But we have footage of Sinwar in the tunnels, wearing shorts and flip-flops, fleeing through tunnels, and carrying a bag which we suspect is full of money. So he's hiding in the tunnels with probably millions of shekels, dollars, whatever currency he has, leaving his people to suffer. And sort of on this note, there's been a lot of reporting, undercover reporting with Gazans to try to get their point of view out. You know, Barry Weiss, who used to be at the New York Times and now started the Free Press, and I encourage you to check out her work, is doing a journalism project where they're interviewing ordinary Gazans off the record in Gaza, and many, many of them are speaking out against Hamas. Now, Al Jazeera has done interviews with Gazans, and the minute Gazans speak negatively about Hamas, Al Jazeera stops the interview, cuts off the interviewee, and erases that tape. So you're not getting, anyone who turns to Al Jazeera for coverage. I never thought it was fair and unbiased, but if you needed more reasons to believe so, they do not cover any anti-Hamas sentiment in their coverage. But Barry Weiss and her project, they are, and you can check that out. But we're seeing more and more that Gazans, I think, are realizing that Hamas is using them as really just as pawns, and that here is Sinwar living underground while the rest of his people suffer. And meanwhile, he's protecting his money and surrounding himself by hostages with the hope that Israel will not be able to kill him or capture him because of the hostages who are surrounding him as human shields. Now, Israel has vowed to capture him dead or alive. We would hope. Can we be sure? Of course, we can't be sure. Also, Israel has said at points that they would consider allowing him to exile and leave and go live in, say, Qatar, if we were to get a certain number of hostages back. So I don't know what his fate will be, but the fact that he was seen on film, I think it's an element of the story that we need to cover. Families of some of the hostages have gone to The Hague to try to press for war crimes against Hamas. As you know, Israel was held on trial at The Hague by the International Court of Justice for genocide, and now families of the hostages are headed to The Hague to try to press for war crimes against Hamas. A United Nations official, Francesca Albanese, you've probably heard her name. Her job is she is the special reporter on human rights within I think it's called Palestine, which is within the Palestinian territories. She has always been virulently anti-Semitic. I mean, as so almost so unbelievably anti-Semitic and anti-Israel that you marvel that she could actually be employed by the UN. But alas, she is. And this week she said that the October 7th massacre was actually not the result of anti-Semitism or hatred of Jews, but simply a reaction to the oppression that Israel has enacted upon Palestinians. This was in response to Macron, the Prime Minister of France, saying that he visited Israel and said that October 7th was a horrific example of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks, and she corrected him, in quotes, corrected him, saying actually not anti-Semitic, was a natural result of the oppression that Israel has enacted upon Palestinians. And I just should also note that she was invited to speak at Harvard this week in a virtual event. She did a virtual event sponsored by Harvard University talking about the situation in the Middle East. So Harvard is giving her a stage and an audience. Last piece of news I want to talk about is Moody's downgraded Israel's credit rating from A1 to A2. How much should we care about this? What does this actually mean? It turns out that this is actually rare. Even during the pandemic, Israel's credit rating was not downgraded. And in past wars and conflicts, Israel's credit rating has not been downgraded. And I researched this a little bit. And the reason why is because these credit ratings are not based on what's happening now. They're based on future projections. So during the pandemic, Moody's and other credit rating agencies still felt that Israel's future was positive. Israel had this whole vaccine rollout. They were really the the example to the rest of the world of how to roll out your vaccines and get the population vaccinated. So there was hope that Israel's future was bright, even if the present was difficult. The same with Israel's past conflicts. They saw that there was a way forward. What's different about right now is Moody's is basically saying that they have no faith in the current government and they don't see a solution ahead. They don't see a government who's putting forth a plan for the day after, whenever this war ends. They're actually very suspicious of infighting among the Jewish population within Israel between the settlers in the West Bank and the Jewish population within 1967 borders Israel proper. So it's this worry about no plan, no foreseeable positive future of Israel that led Moody's to downgrade the credit rating. And this could have consequences for prices, for the strength of the shekel against the dollar, for investments in Israeli companies. Will the average Israeli on the street feel it? Will I feel it? I mean, I don't know. I don't feel it today. It just happened. But I think for the health of the country, it also sends a bad sign because people look to this. When people look to invest in Israel, they look at these ratings by Moody's and other companies, and it shows that I think I felt for a while that we need new elections and that Netanyahu needs to go, if for no other reason than because of the message it sends to the rest of the world. Right now, I think there is a little window where the Middle East could drastically change, if not forever, then for the foreseeable future. So many countries are realizing that this idea of a nebulous West Bank and Gaza is unhealthy for everyone, that it's violent, it's bad for Israel, but it's also bad for the rest of the world. And we have a chance here to have separation from the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. And I think the right leader would see this as an opportunity. Maybe it would be hard in the moment, but for Israel's long-term future, this could be the time when Israel could separate and have the world behind us, have the world supporting us in that separation. But Netanyahu is fleeing from that opportunity at every opportunity, and his standing to the rest of the world is negative. And I think that's another reason why this Moody's downgrade happened, and why I think we need a change of leadership in Israel. And by far, I'm not the only one. I want to get to your questions now, and more of you are writing in ahead of time, and that's great. It always gives me time to prepare and get some answers going. And I really thank you for writing in. So we had a few people write in about the hostages. Claire wrote in, Stu wrote in. Is there any news regarding the remaining hostages, specifically the Bibas child who turned 1 year old about a month ago? There really is no news. We're hearing from hostages who've come back about what they've been going through, about their ordeals, but we're not hearing any more news about where they are or the possibilities of them coming back, especially now that we're not sending a delegation to Cairo to negotiate further. It doesn't seem like there will be any sort of deal on the table. So I wish I had more to report on that, but we really do not know much right now. We have a question for Nora, who I believe lives in Colombia in South America, if I'm not mistaken. Nora writes, I've always been curious about why Israeli Arabs don't do mandatory military service and how it works out in terms of their national identity and sense of belonging. That's a great question. Let me give you a little bit of background here. So as I've said before, 22% of Israel's population is not Jewish, right? So Israel is 78% Jewish, but 22% of Israel is not Jewish. It's mostly Arab, Christian, Muslim, and Druze. And Muslim and Christian Arabs are not drafted into the IDF. And the reason, I think, is simply what you might call conflict of interest, that it is, in the end, a Jewish army, and they are not Jewish. And especially given everything going on in Gaza and the West Bank, it just doesn't seem like a viable option for them, but also for us. We don't want to arm them and put them in the IDF. And so the rule is that Muslim and Christian Arabs are not drafted into the Israeli army. Now, they can volunteer, and I have met some of these volunteers. They're far and few between, don't get the wrong idea, but there are Muslim and Christian Arabs who are serving in the IDF by choice because they feel that it is their army and that as people who live in Israel, they need to do their duty to protect the country along with their fellow Jewish citizens. But for the most part, the vast, vast majority of Arab Muslims and Christians do not serve. However, Druze Arabs are drafted into the IDF. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Druze Arabs have the highest rate of conscription in the IDF of any population in Israel, higher even than the Jewish population. Why is that? Because 15% of Jewish Israelis do not serve in the Israeli army. We talked about that before, the ultra-Orthodox Haredi population. So when you do the math, it turns out that the highest percentage of any group serving in the IDF are the Druze. And Druze culture is a culture that is loyal to whichever government is in power. So when Druze in the Golan Heights were under Syria, they were loyal to Syria. Now those very same Druze families are loyal to Israel. You are loyal to the government in power. And this is exemplified by the numbers in battle. Since October 7th, we've had, sadly, a number of Druze soldiers who've been killed in Gaza. I think the numbers between 8 and 10, including Lieutenant Colonel Salman Habaka, who was the Lieutenant Colonel, the commanding officer of the 74th Armored Battalion in the 188th Armored Brigade. That's the brigade that I was in as a tank soldier. And he rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, and he was one of the first soldiers to die. I think he was in the first 20 to die after October 7th. But it really does show you that the Druze do participate in the IDF, and that segment of the population does get drafted, and they do serve. Brenda writes in with a very interesting question. Brenda writes, I've been reading about the painful dilemmas surrounding how best to balance commemorating the victims of October 7th while also helping people return to a sense of normalcy. For example, some in the Otef communities, that's the southern part of Israel right next to Gaza, believe that it's important for people to come and see the destruction with their own eyes, while others feel it's an invasion of their privacy. And some of the roadside shelters have been cleaned of blood and repainted, while others bear messages in memory of those who were killed there. So Brenda wants to know what's my opinion about these pilgrimages to these sites and erecting permanent memorials and rebuilding these communities in the South. Look, it's a very difficult question. My daughter has been serving in the Army in the reserves, and she's been going down to the South to help soldiers who are coming out of the Army learn about the economic benefits that are available to them. And she says that as she drives through the South, you see signs, you see sticks in the ground with a picture of someone who was killed on that spot. And they're all over. It's not one sign here or there. As you drive through the South, you see these markers where people have been killed. Many of the bomb shelters in the South had messages written on the walls from those who were holed up inside them before they were killed. And the government decided to repaint over all of these without telling anyone. But that's simply what they did. I think because they wanted to sort of erase the memory of their own failure to not protect the country on October 7th. But in any case, I think the line has to be drawn between public and private. I definitely think that we're going to see some public memorials built in the South. You know, Kibbutz Be'eri was begun to be bulldozed this past week as they rebuild that kibbutz. They bulldozed some of the buildings where the destruction happened. We do need memorials, but at the same time, you know, in my opinion, I don't want to turn the entire South into one big memorial because that's horrifying. I think we need to select a certain number of sites where a few specific memorials will go, and we need to absolutely commemorate those who died and were kidnapped. But to turn every single space where someone was killed on October 7th, I mean, you'd be literally talking about 1,200 separate spaces more, and I think that could be damaging to the psychology of the country if we had a memorial at every single spot. So, in terms of people going down, let's say you go on a tour of Israel, you want to see the South. I think there are ways to do it. Driving Highway 232 will give you a sense. You'll see enough doing that. Doesn't mean you have to get out of your car and walk into the actual communities. That could be an invasion of privacy, but look, it needs to be done tastefully. We need to remember, but we also need to move forward. And this is something that Israel is going to struggle with. Last question that someone wrote in, Selma and Murray asked, why did Hamas take bodies into Gaza on October 7th? To us, it sounds so bizarre. And the simple question to that is, these are bargaining chips. The same way that live Israelis are bargaining chips for Hamas, dead bodies are also bargaining chips. We've had a number of Israeli soldiers who've been held since Cast Lead in, I believe, 2016, 2012. Someone maybe can look that up, but we still have not gotten their bodies back. Hamas knows that we value our soldiers, our citizens, and will do anything to get them back. If God forbid they've been killed, we still want that body back. That is a Jewish thing, to give them a proper burial, a proper shiva. And they know that the more bodies they have, it's the more bargaining chips they have on their side. And so that is why they kidnapped bodies on October 7th. And I also want to point out that it wasn't just Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We had ordinary citizens pouring into Israel from Gaza, kidnapping live and dead Israelis just for sport as souvenirs. So we can't forget that angle as well. That concludes tonight's episode. As you can tell, I might be losing my voice a little bit. So instead of taking more questions from the chat, I am going to call it right here. I do want to thank you all for turning out and remind you that next week we're going to be back to Tuesday. Next week, Inside Israel will take place once again on Tuesday. That is February 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Tuesday at 8 Eastern is always my normal sort of preferred time when I can, if the tour schedule allows for it. Again, if you want to listen to this offline, if you can't make it to the live show, then it is a podcast on Apple and Spotify. And I just put the links in the chat for the Apple podcast link and the Spotify link if you want to watch it, listen to it there. You can also watch the video of this on my website. It's on YouTube, but the easiest place is on my website. Just go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast and you can see this. The most recent episode will always be there starting on Thursday morning. And if you want to get the links to see the live broadcast, the best way to do that is to go to, well, really the only way to do that is to go to my website, which is joelchasnoff.com. Sign up for the newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, and that is also where I send out the links each time. I want to thank you all for turning out tonight. It's great to see such a large audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get to the questions in the chat, but the jet lag is catching up with me. The trip in from Israel yesterday is, I guess, wearing me out more than I thought. But next week, I will get to all the questions you send in. Until next time, only good things. Rak beshalom and Valentine's Day Sameach lekulam. Thanks so much for coming out tonight, everyone. I'll keep the chat going for a few more minutes so you can hang out amongst yourselves.